Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. You're listening to the longest running superhero role playing game on earth. I'm your host, the Game Master, and boy, did I have a crappy night last night. No pun intended. My family and I were out for the night, and when we got home, we found that the plumbing in the upstairs bathroom had started to overflow for some reason while we were away, and that the floor was flooded with water. And there's a lot of things about this that sucks, but one of those things is the room under the bathroom is my son's room. And like we moved here 5 years ago. We live in a log cabin in the middle of the woods. It's very nice. I got extremely lucky to get this place. But at any rate, when our landlord built this house back in the 70s, there was some other barn somewhere in this neighborhood that was destroyed. I don't know if it was a tornado or, you know, it was before my time. I wasn't quite born yet. But the point is, he took that barn uh wood, the siding and stuff like that. And so this room downstairs was a billiards room. He had a really nice pool table in the middle. It's got like natural wood floors like you would have inside of some barns. All of the walls are kind of that reddish, weathered barn wood. You know what I'm talking about? The door in and out of the room is a literal barn door that slides, to the side to open it and go in. And so when we moved here, that my son thought it was a really cool room. That's what he wanted for his bedroom. And so that's the room he lives in, of course, and he's got a desk with a really nice gaming computer on it, and we use that for Discord, and specifically, I have him record the game when we play on Discord. And so what happened yesterday was the ceiling of his room are these wooden boards, and then the cracks between the boards had water coming down on his computer. And so, I mean, there's so many parts of this. This sucks. But one of those many parts is that the adventure was on the computer. Um, we had recorded it over Discord, and it wasn't even a single game session. This was comprised of multiple game sessions. We really unpacked it because it's kind of a complicated idea. It ends with a fight, but everything that led up to that, it's weird enough. We wanted to sort of give each layer of the story a little time to breathe and to be comprehensible and so on and so forth, right? So unfortunately, I don't have that now, right? I can't just share that with you. So I'm going to do my best to just explain what we did, um, and hopefully this makes sense. So the prologue to this adventure is actually little pieces of multiple adventures, right? And by the way, this was inspired by Action Comics number 243. So the idea is that there was this woman, and you know how a lot of Kryptonian names, not all of them, of course, but a lot of them, it is often like three letters and then like a hyphen and then two letters, right? They did that with the name Circe, like CIR hyphen CE, right? So they said that Circe was actually from Krypton and that she was some sort of like an ancient astronaut or something like that who had gone to Earth. So when we hear about Circe, in Greek mythology. It is actually supposed to be the stories of this Kryptonian woman. And she's famous for some sort of a drink or a serum or something in that vein that she gives to a man, and then he turns into some kind of an animal man, right? So in the story, in Action Comics 243, the Superman of the Silver Age, Clark Kent, ends up in that part of the world, Greece or whatever, and he encounters Circe, and she offers him a drink, and it turns him into, in the comics, it turns him into a lion man. And at the time, way back when in the 90s, when I first ran this part of it, I mean, I was playing a werebear who had gotten the Infinity Gauntlet for a little while, and then he sort of wished, or whatever you want to call it, to be as strong as Superman. And so a lot of people couldn't wrap their head around that. They thought that was too complicated for them. And they're like, well, like, is he a werebear or is he Superman? And I was like, well, he's kind of both, because he used the Infinity Gauntlet, right? And he can just do whatever you want. Anybody could use the Infinity Gauntlet to wish they had the powers of Superman. To me, it was not a hard concept to grasp, but for a lot of other people, it was. And I was trying to kind of, I guess, signal to the players of the 90s that this idea of sort of a Superman analog, but who also has this animal stuff going on, that's had been done before, right? That there was a precedent for this sort of a thing. So we did the story from that comic. And the way I did it then, because there was a werebear, that I was trying to draw parallels to, we then specifically said that this serum that Circe had invented, and in Silver Age fashion, if she's on Earth, that means she has super intelligence, right? If you think about it, and I know a lot of people don't think of it this way, Clark Kent was a farm boy who still invented completely realistic Superman robots. You know what I mean? Um, so that's the old Silver Age super intelligence at work. So I had said that she used her intelligence to come up with this serum that gave the target lycanthropy. And in Action Comics 243, they said that it makes you turn into whatever animal kind of best suits your personality. So in the case of Superman, he was a lion. And then so specifically with us, we said he was a were-lion. And I thought that was cool because, he's not walking around on all fours and stuff like that. He's more kind of like a furry. And by the way, in our stuff, I'm a huge fan of a Superman artist named Ed McGuinness. And if you're unfamiliar with him, Google him, check him out. I think he's awesome. Uh, Ed McGuinness was an artist on Superman when I owned my comic book store like 25 years ago. But at any rate, something I really liked about his Superman art was he made Superman just huge. He was just so muscular, right? And so that is kind of how I like to think of our version of Super Lion, is he's just jacked. He would just be enormous. Like if I was going to make a live action movie, I'd get like the guy who played the Mountain on Game of Thrones. You know what I mean? I can't think of that guy's name in real life. It's like Bjorn something, I think. But the dude is just massive, right? I'd get him, and then I would try to hire like the very best like prosthetic special effects artists in Hollywood and try to make him like this completely realistic, just savage looking, like badass lion dude, right? And then on top of all that, then you add a Superman costume, right? So, I want to try to paint this picture in your head as, don't think of it as silly, you know? And by the way, the reason that we revisited this idea is my son and I were watching Invincible, and they have a character named Battle Beast, who I love. And if I remember correctly, he's voiced by Michael Dorn, who I love. So that kind of got me thinking back about our Super Lion character, and I'm like, dude, we should bring this guy back. Like, Super Lion's kind of a cool idea. Well, so what we do then is, Superman becomes a were-lion, and he, for a little while, is doing stuff with kids, where kids are kind of like, and again, this is a very Silver Agey kind of a story, where kids would go to the circus and be really excited to see a lion. I feel like today's kids are more jaded and maybe wouldn't care, and you know what I mean, right? But, back then with that mentality, you need to sort of step into that headspace. Him posing with kids as a lion was like a really super exciting thing, right? And at one point in the comic, he's like opening his mouth and he's so big that kids can actually stick their heads in his mouth, and they're thinking that's awesome, and it's like this thrilling thing these kids are doing. And so we then say in our game, this is where we diverge from the comics. We just said that Lex Luthor, pays somebody then to go get a little sample of DNA while all this is going on. Sort of like the swab thing they do in your mouth, you know what I mean? So after that, sort of things play out like they do in the comic. He's eventually cured and so on and so forth. Superman's not a were-lion anymore. Um, but we take that idea, we take the ball and we try to run with it. So we say that Luthor clones Superman, but that the clone is a were-lion. And so then we had Brad, one of our newest player, really. He was not a Superman fan. And so like I had talked to him some in real life, and he's like part Native American. He's an interesting dude. He's literally like a bounty hunter in real life, and a bail bondsman. And he told me at one point, I guess he's like part Native American, and he's really into like cracking and what would you call it, like outdoorsmanship. And like a lot of this more kind of nature kind of stuff, and I think he's more kind of into animals and stuff like that. But he's not really into, say, a character like Batman, who just arrests the Joker, and then the Joker breaks loose and hurts innocent bystanders, right? Brad was more into like the Punisher or Peacemaker, where it's like a permanent solution. You know what I mean? Where these characters don't put the villain in jail, they put them 6 feet under, right? That's where Brad's coming from. That's what he likes. And so, as we're getting into this stuff with these Superman characters that I want to run, I thought the Super Lion would be a good character for Brad. And then, since he wasn't a Superman fan, I didn't even tell him what we were doing when we started. And kudos to him, by the way, for having kind of like blind faith in me as a game master. That he's played in, whatever, a dozen games of mine now or something like that, and that it's enough that he likes my kind of GM style, and he he just went with it, and that's great. I think that's absolutely the way to go when you're playing in a role-playing game. Um, but so I said, you're this kind of mystery character, and you're sort of like a Tarzan in a way, where you're or like Mowgli from the Jungle Book, where you're like a little kid and you don't really know where you're from or anything like that. But there's this guy who shows up, claims to be your father, and when I described this guy, I totally described Lex Luthor. And and we kind of go through the years where we start with, when Action Comics 243 was published. I don't have it in front of me right now, but I want to say it's something like maybe 1958, 1959, something like that. So, for a ballpark figure there, then that means that this clone was quote unquote born around 1960, basically, right? And so when I'm describing Lex Luthor, in those early games, I'm saying that he looks the way he would have looked in the 60s, right? And that we start to say, all right, so time is going by. And I started off, and I can't remember specifically what we did, but he's on an alien planet. So none of these animals are exactly like Earth animals. I was using the stats of animals out of the book. The DC Heroes third edition book has a bunch of animal stats in the back. I would pick something like a dog or a rabbit or whatever, that was in the book, and then I would slightly change the descriptions. But I said, you're on this planet where there's a red sun. And so, at this point he has no powers or anything like that. And I'm like, um you're hunting for food. And that Lex Luthor's whole deal is he wants you to grow up and be dangerous, right? And so he does want more of the lion than the man, basically, right? And so from a very young age, this poor kid has to hunt for food. And so he's learning to take down prey and stuff like that. And we used the were-lions from White Wolf, by the way, for the how we would modify the Superman stats. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. But the idea there that I wanted to mention was just that he doesn't transform into a were-lion until he hits puberty. So we started with games set before that. And he just seems to be a human kid, and he's still able to catch rabbits and take down like what is essentially an alien coyote or something like that. And he keeps going up, and we keep raising what it is that he's able to take down. And then he becomes a were-lion when he hits puberty. And so now he's taken a couple years to try to gain control of that, and he actually does. He got this whole time, by the way, Brad was getting like amazing rolls. If you roll about a 10, that's like average. A 20 is like really, really good. Hardly any of his rolls were, I think, below a 15, like through this whole process. It was crazy. But at any rate, so once he's like a were-lion, again, under the red sun, so he's just like a normal were-lion, he starts taking this stuff down, and he starts taking down deer, and he ends up fighting with other things. He fought a wolf pack. Um, he tried to find lion-like alien animals and sort of be kind of the alpha male of this pride of lions, and so on and so forth. And then one day Lex Luthor shows up, and Luthor had shown up every great once in a while. And in my mind, it was maybe like once a season, like once every 3 months. Luthor kind of shows up and is like, so how is this sort of side experiment of mine coming along? How you do what have you killed recently? And he tells him. And like the closest thing to affection this kid has is that Luthor is like, oh, good job, you killed a bigger animal. right? And so that psychology is starting to fall into place there, where sort of love or whatever you want to put it, he's equating it with killing. And so at some point, Lex shows up one day and he's got a ship, and he drops the ramp on the back of this, small starship thing. And he says, you've done a good job, and we're ready for phase two. And he takes him to a different planet, which is another just kind of wild M-class planet with no people around. And he turns him loose there, but now this kid is under a yellow sun, and he's like a teenager or whatever. And so I describe, you're running and like you really like the feeling of this sun for some reason beating down on you. And as he's running, like his feet hit the ground, and when his feet come up off the ground, there's like a few seconds that are going by before his feet need to hit the ground again. And so as he's sort of tear-assing through this alien landscape, he's starting to get the super speed and stuff like that. And at one point he jumps, and I think it was he takes down like an alien T-Rex. And when he hits it, he just like destroys this thing. But then he like takes its head off in this kind of, it's like a tackle, but he's using his claws, and he's like sinking his teeth into the thing's neck, and all this other stuff. But he like rips the head off of this like basically alien dinosaur kind of thing. But then he's like flying. And so he's like, well, this is awesome, and he's just like flying around this world and just being tough, and so he appreciates how powerful he is, and this was me kind of taking Brad in baby steps about playing a Superman character can be fun. It doesn't have to be like what do I want to say? Like it can be really badass, basically. You know what I mean? And so finally, Lex shows up one day, and at this point, Brad has kind of like his own lion pride kind of thing, and he's got like this harem of like female lions, and he's actually kind of spending more time in lion mode, and he's kind of not spending time in man mode very much anymore. You know what I mean? And I kind of asked Brad about that. Like, would you do that, or would you think of yourself more as a man? And he said he thought he would think of himself more as a lion because he's not spending any time around humans really. There's Lex, but that's it. And he's having way more kind of animal encounters and stuff. So he feels he is an animal, right? And so at any rate, Lex shows up, and Brad goes to Krynos, which is the big warrior mode that is like half man, half lion, that the third out of five modes. And where he's basically a furry. He's like a huge, and again, I imagine this almost like if it was comic book art, it would be Ed McGuinness drawing it, right? He's just this huge, incredible Hulk size, kind of roided out, massive dude. And Lex is like, okay, I want to take you to another planet called Earth. And so now we're up to about 1980, give or take a little, right? Maybe a little after that, like early 80s. But he takes him to Earth, and the ship sets down in Central Park. And by now, Lex Luthor is wearing the power armor, the classic 80s green power armor with the purple trim. And he kind of walks down the ramp, and he's like, do me proud, son. That kind of thing. And so the lion, Super Lion comes out, and and Luthor gave him the costume. And I forgot, I left a huge part out, which is Luthor says, what if I told you you were not like the apex predator of the universe? That there's this guy named Superman, and you need to take him down now. Like your whole life has been training for this. And so, in a weird way, our Super Lion character we called Leo was almost like a doomsday figure in a way. You know what I mean? And so he just shows up in the park there in Metropolis and roars so loud it was breaking glass, whether we're talking about skyscrapers or just the cars, whatever. He roars so loud he breaks glass. And then my son was playing Superman, and my son did a great job. And we're playing the old Christopher Reeve soundtrack, in the background and stuff like that. And we're kind of like, one day in Metropolis, and but in a good way, right? And so he ducks into a closet, changes into the costume, so on and so forth, and he gets there. And when he finds Super Lion is setting fire to cars on the streets of Metropolis using heat vision. So Superman um fights him, and he says something like, care to step outside, or whatever, and he's more or less quoting the moment with the Christopher Reeve Superman and General Zod from Superman 2, where I think he says something like, care to step outside, General? Um, so it's kind of a moment like that. And so they go up into the sky because Superman wants to get him away from people, right? He doesn't want their superpowered punches and stuff like that to create shockwaves that are going to like destroy buildings and hurt innocent bystanders and so on and so forth. And so it's kind of cool. They go up in the sky. Super Lion chases him now. He's in chase mode, and they fight. And then Superman specifically punches him, and he's like, I want to use my strength of 50 versus this guy's weight of 3 or 4 APs or whatever it is. And I want then, subtract that weight from the APs of strength. And that is the distance I want to punch him through space into the planet Mars. And so I was like, that's a really cool visual. Like I can see that in my head. And so we say it's like he makes this incredible contact, gets a really solid, great roll. Super Lion flies, and I was saying, Superman can punch you so hard you move faster than light because speed of light is only 29 APs. So it's very easy for Superman to just like pick up a rock and throw it at warp speed, right? When we're talking about pre-crisis Superman, who's just insane, and that's exactly what these two guys are. Two pre-crisis Supermen going at it. So it's like a quiet day on Mars when all of a sudden you this screaming sound come out of the sky, and the Super Lion comes in at like a 45-degree angle, hits the ground, is tearing across the ground, just cutting this ravine into the face of Mars, kicking up dust. And when the smoke clears, he gets up out of it, costume torn, eyes glowing red, roaring and stuff. And then Superman's on him. Superman flies and just comes down and hits him. And these guys are just beating the crap out of each other. And they do that for a little bit. And then one of them punches another one, and they end up out by Pluto. And they just keep going at it. And it's this knockdown, drag out fight. And one of the things that I described was I said, it's a little bit like Spider-Man fighting Venom, where they basically have the same powers, but Venom is like bigger and stronger. And so the Krynos form adds column shifts to Leo's strength and stuff. So even though he's a clone of Clark and they're human modes, they would be, biologically like played by the same actor, for instance. I would imagine them both as a human. Both of them would look like sort of a roided out Christopher Reeve, basically, right? But Leo would have like long hair and a beard, and you know what I mean? Hopefully you get that gist. If I'm doing a bad job explaining any of this, just say something in the comments and I'll clear it up, as always. But at any rate, but then of course he transforms, he gets bigger in his Krynos mode and stuff like that. So that's kind of that idea that Venom is huge and Spider-Man's kind of smaller and stuff. It's kind of like that. Superman's a big guy, but Leo is way bigger in Krynos mode. So they fight, and Leo kind of wins in a way, um, where he hits Superman and knocks him into the negatives. But what Brad was unfamiliar with, because he hasn't played a lot of DC heroes yet, is he didn't know how the invulnerability power worked. Superman has 50 APs of invulnerability. And so when you hit him and knock him a little bit into the negatives, let's say he's 5 points in the negatives, right? Let's say he's at -5 is his current body. You would then roll his 50 APs of invulnerability versus a 5. And then however many RAPs you get on table number 2 is how far back up into the positives it sends him again. So Superlion hits him thinking it's going to be like a knockout, and instead, suddenly Superman's kind of got his second wind and keeps working over the lion, right? But Superman is declaring knockout damage only. He doesn't want to kill. He actually feels bad for the lion. Doesn't know his story yet. We get into that more later. He has actually a great deal of compassion and doesn't even see him as an enemy, despite the fact the lion's trying to kill him. So, so because of all that, um, oh, and by the way, I left a funny moment out, which is I realized they go off to Mars and they're beating the crap out of each other on Mars, you know. And I'm like, wait, there's like all these fires in Metropolis. And so again, it's the early 80s. So we've got Superman Red, and we've got stories about him elsewhere on the channel. Check those out if you're curious. But that was kind of the Superman Red era. So he shows up and he's wearing a Superman costume where the red and the blue is reversed. And he's not Clark, he's another guy named John. But the point is, he um he shows up and uses super breath to blow out these various fires. And I said there were a couple girls on the sidewalk and they're wearing like the 80s aerobics outfits with like leg warmers and neon colors and all that stuff. And he kind of stops to lean on a parking meter and is like, "Hey, ladies." So it was like a nice little comedy moment that kind of broke up some of the action scenes. At any rate, so speaking of the action scenes, they're fighting out there, and eventually Superman takes Super Lion down to 0. And Brad is like, okay, now I get to roll invulnerability, right? And we're like, no, it only works if it's a negative number, not 0. You know, that's the game itself does not want you to kill. And Brad, he was a good sport about it, but I could tell he was like, well, that sucks. Like I just got defeated, you know. And then from his point of view, he has taken down all of these opponents and so on and so forth, right? And Lex did kind of sell him on the idea that Superman is the ultimate prey, you know? And so he's like, well, that sucks. Like I actually lost, you know? And then my son, which I can tell if I keep running Superman stories, my son is too smart. He's going to be a problem, and it's going to be hard to run Superman with him. He's like, so I want to fly back in time because in the Silver Age stuff, you know, the old pre-crisis era, I mean, Superman would just fly back and forth to the 30th century to hang out with the Legion of Superheroes. It was just no big deal for him. I assume the famous moment in the first Christopher Reeve movie where he's flying around the Earth, I suspect that what they had in mind in the script was more like that time travel we saw, where he'd go back and forth to the 30th century and the 20th century. So he's like, if I can go back in time, I just want to go back in time a little bit, not much, get the Phantom Zone projector out of the Fortress of Solitude, and then I want it to time it so that when I fly back here, it is now. It is the moment that I knocked him out. And the reason he did that was because as a were-lion, he had regeneration that had not quite hit yet. And he knew if he left to go get the projector and then come back without using time travel, Brad's character, Leo, would have just regenerated and woken up and been a problem again, right? So he does that. He does the time travel trick. He gets the Phantom Zone projector and he puts Leo in the Phantom Zone. And so then the next thing we see is and this is again the first edition DC Heroes Superman source book is where we're getting a lot of these stats from. There's this device listed in the book that gives Superman the ability to communicate with people in the zone. There's kind of like a view screen, like a TV screen, kind of an idea. And he can see people in the Phantom Zone and he can talk to them and they're looking at him, kind of like on Star Trek when one ship calls another ship and the captains can talk or whatever. It's kind of along those lines. So I don't think we see what the zoners would see on their end. I don't know if it would be like a hologram or a portal or what it would be, but whatever the case may be, right? There's communication there. And so he just starts talking to him. And I thought that was really nice. And that was something we don't often see with a lot of versions of Superman is his just willingness to sit down with an enemy and talk. And so he starts to learn all of this stuff that happened to Leo and how messed up that is for a kid to grow up that way. And Superman starts to kind of extend an olive branch and say, Lex Luthor's actually a really bad guy, and you didn't deserve to be raised that way. And his whole thing is like, you're my clone. I don't want you to be my enemy. Like, I want you to be my brother, and it was this great moment. Really, really well done. And so that basically is what you need to know for the prologue. This whole thing is prologue. And this video has gone on forever, so I'm gonna make the next part brief. So the point is then there's this guy named Maldor the Dark Lord, right? And he is hard to explain. He's a very, very powerful being. In my humble opinion, and this is just me, you're welcome to disagree. I think that if you look at the context clues, um, at how they wrote Maldor, I think they either intended for him to be the DC version of Mephisto, or he kind of was going to be the devil for the DC universe, or multiple devils is often kind of the case in comics. Like for instance, if you talk about the Grim Reaper, like Necron at DC is supposedly death, right? But then in the Sandman comics, there's this girl with like white skin and black hair, and she's death, right? So hold on, what do you mean? There's more than one death? Yeah, actually. And so sometimes in comics, there's kind of more than one devil, right? I strongly suspect that Maldor was on some level supposed to be either literally the devil or at the very least inspired by the idea of the devil. And so he works in very similar ways and has kind of like very similar powers. And he's got like curly red hair and a goatee, kind of like you would expect the devil to have. He looks maybe Caucasian or possibly maybe something more kind of like his armor looks kind of Roman to me. He's got like a silver breastplate kind of thing, and then he's got like these like silver shoulder pads that made me think the artist was trying to remind you of kind of like the Roman Empire. He's got like a purple, I don't know what to call it, like that skirt thing that they gave the Gal Gadot version of Wonder Woman. You know what I mean? Kind of like leather straps hanging down there over the kind of pelvic area. Um, and then he had a golden sword. But at any rate, yeah, so that's Maldor. And Maldor has a ton of powers, and one of them is dimension travel. And so he uses dimension travel to pull himself into this. other dimension where he also sort of creates this barren wasteland of a planet with nothing there. And then he creates what is essentially the Roman Colosseum. And I said that the sky here kind of looked like the sky from the old He-Man cartoon, um, almost kind of like a nebula kind of a vibe. And then on Earth, the current Superman now is Clark Kent III, and he's the grandson of the original Superman. Um, and then Super Lion now in the modern day, because we're no longer doing that stuff in the past that kind of talks about Super Lion's origins. In 2025, Brad said he thought he would be a biker. And then we're kind of doing that lion pride kind of idea again, but now it's like biker chicks. He's got this like harem of kind of like slutty biker chicks. And and so he's kind of the head honcho of these guys and so on and so forth. And then Maldor uses dimension travel to summon Super Lion to this Coliseum. And then Maldor summons Superman from Metropolis also to the Coliseum. And he wants the two of them to fight to the death for his amusement. And he basically says, I'm this incredibly ancient being and I'm bored and I like death. So I want you guys to kill each other. And Superman was the one that won the earlier thing where I had my son and Brad play. In this one, Brad kind of wins. Super Lion attacks Maldor and was just faster. He had the highest initiative. He gets in there, does a bunch of damage. By the way, this is kind of a brief aside. I read every appearance of Maldor. He, to the best of my knowledge, only ever was a pre-crisis character. We've never seen him revisited after the crisis. Um, People keep saying that he's like omnipotent or whatever. But if you only look at what he does in his appearances, I don't think that he is. And so when I gave him stats on paper, it only represented, if I didn't see him do it in the comic, I did not assume he had that power, right? Does that make sense? So based only on what we saw, Brad just tears into him and gets a lot of good rolls again. I don't think Brad rolled under a 15 at all. And just tears him up. And it took a few rounds, but then Maldor was just done. And so then they were like, well, crap, how do we get back? Right? How do we go back to the Earth K dimension? And they ended up using the bar door. And so for those that didn't catch my recent birthday game, in that we at great lengths talk about how this bar door works. And the idea is there's this tiki bar on Earth K called the Continuum Bar and Grill. And the bar door there uses quantum entanglement to link up with other bar doors throughout all of time and space, and that includes other dimensions. And so you can walk through a bar door elsewhere, but you walk into the Tiki Bar on Earth K. And so Superman, the modern Superman, Clark Kent III, he had been there before. He knew exactly how it worked. So he and Leo, the Super Lion, and they've got Maldor thrown over a shoulder, by the way, walk into the Tiki Bar. And the bartender currently is Superman Red, who we mentioned earlier from all the way back in, the early 80s. And there was this great beat where Superman Red and Leo see each other and don't like each other. And it's not that they're enemies, they're not going to try to kill each other. Um, if anything, it kind of reminded me of Seinfeld when, Jerry would see Newman and be like, hello, Newman. And it just had disdain in his voice. It was kind of like that kind of a thing. And so Superman Red was so unhappy that Super Lion knows what the Continuum Bar and Grill is now. So he can come here anytime he wants and be a pain. So he was not happy about that. Um, so they go and they put Maldor into the Phantom Zone, which I thought was very interesting because Maldor has dimension travel and hasn't woken up yet, right? And I didn't mention this to my players, but I will mention it to you guys. I think that's interesting. Um, and then the epilogue for this was Superman and Super Lion use the bar door yet again, and Superman gets a root beer float when he goes in the bar because he doesn't want to use the bar door and not actually buy anything. He thinks that'd be rude. And the root beer float, by the way, is a nice little nod to Superman the animated series, where we find out that's Superman's favorite drink. Um, so at any rate, they use the bar door to go back to Maldor's dimension, which is an entire dimension full of these worlds that he had subjugated. And so they just start helping these worlds. They're working on making those lives better. And so then Super Lion in this other dimension is now having adventures kind of like maybe you would expect Lobo to have, where he's kind of um encountering these various aliens. And like something I said was in DC, there's no end of stories where Superman encounters some kind of an alien who's pretty much as tough as Superman because the writers want Superman to have a challenge. They don't want it to just be, he just wins hands down and it's not a problem. That's, not as interesting. So I was like, I feel like that would apply to this dimension, and there'd be tons of these alien races that are like a challenge for Super Lion, and that's kind of his deal is he loves a challenge. So he's looking for bad guys that need dealt with. And that was it. That was the epilogue of the whole thing. But like I said, we had broken that down. That was multiple adventures. It kind of sucks that I don't have that all edited together on Discord to give you. But like I said, our house flooded. So it is what it is. This has been a very long video. Um, so I'm gonna get going. Thank you guys so much, as always, for supporting the channel. Uh, I love you guys. You guys are tremendous. As always, if you want to take a quick minute to help out by hitting like and subscribe and leaving us a comment, it would mean a lot to us. And from everybody here at the longest running superhero role playing game on earth, we hope you have a good one, and we'll see you in the next adventure. Bye.